So as mentioned, I am Krista Seiden. I'm the analytics advocate for Google, which means I get to do a lot of speaking, teaching, and training at conferences all around the world. But I'm also a product manager on Google Analytics, so it's actually a very cool dual role because I get to bring a lot of that information back to Google and help to build a better product for all of you. So today I'm here to talk to you about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is measurement for growth. So we're going to talk about three things. First, we're going to talk about what is growth. Then we're going to talk about some growth strategies. And finally, the majority of the talk is going to be about measurement for growth. So let's dig right in. What is growth? We've heard this term a lot in the past many years, and it's something that you hear thrown around, but we don't necessarily all have the same idea of what it is. So let's level set for this presentation. Growth hacking is a process of rapid experimentation across marketing channels and product development to identify the most efficient ways to grow a business. And growth hackers are marketers, engineers, and product managers that specifically focus on building and engaging the user base. Okay, now that we all have an idea of what I'm going to talk about, let's talk about all of the words we hear when it comes to growth. We hear A/B testing, SEO, experimentation, content, growth, engineering, product. So many different words are thrown out when it comes to this topic. So essentially, a growth hacker is Wonder Woman. That's funny, come on. There you go. All right, so last year I was in San Francisco. I'm from San Francisco. And I actually am a co-chair of the San Francisco chapter of the Digital Analytics Association. We bring in a lot of different guest speakers and have evening events for our community to really grow and understand various topics. So last year, we actually brought in a guest speaker who was a growth leader in the Bay Area. And we posed this question to him. We said, what is growth and growth hacking? How is that different than digital marketing, digital analytics, all of the things that we do every day? So he gave us a nice little talk about the benefits of growth marketing, growth hacking, but we really pushed him. So he started to draw this funnel on the board. And what he essentially said was that there are multiple parts of a funnel for a business, for a growth funnel. And the top two, acquisition and activation, this is what a digital marketer does. They focus on these two parts of this funnel. But then we also have retention and revenue and referral to fill out this funnel. And the combination of all of these is what a growth hacker does. So I'm sitting in the audience. I see a few smiles when I say that. I'm sitting in the audience, and I've spent a lot of my career actually building, running analytics and optimization and digital marketing programs that cross every area of this funnel. But I hadn't called myself a growth hacker before. I was a digital marketer. That's what I live and breathe. And so I actually took a little bit of offense to this because I don't think that there's this divide between digital marketer and growth hacker when it comes to the areas of the funnel that you touch. I also hate the term growth hacking. So for the rest of this conversation, I'm going to say growth marketing or growth, but please don't call it growth hacking. In fact, I was in a very lively discussion earlier this year on Twitter about this term, growth hacking. And there was this wonderful quote by this woman named Dana DiTomaso. And she said that growth hacking started because people, mostly men, didn't want to call themselves marketers. Just wasn't cool enough. Marketers were looked down upon, particularly in tech. So growth hacking is really just digital marketing. Now, I really appreciate this quote. I feel very similarly. I heard some laughs and some head nods, so I guess some of you do too. But the point here is that anybody that is a digital marketer and touching all of these different parts of the funnel can be a growth marketer too, or is a growth marketer too, and there's not this big divide. There are a couple of things that I do think set growth marketing in general apart when it comes to kind of the strategy and how teams are organized. So the first is the idea of product market fit. Now, this is the idea that you have a product and you have a market, and that product actually fits in the market. Pretty simple, right? Product market fit. Now, a good example of this is Uber. Uber comes into cities and countries all over the world, and they launch, and they think that they're going to have market penetration. And in most places, they do pretty well. It picks up. I know I've used Uber a lot here in Australia. Works great. But there's been some recent times where Uber hasn't succeeded in places that they've gone. They recently just pulled out of Southeast Asia in general. Now you can only use Gojek and what's the other one? Yeah, that one. I used that a lot a few weeks ago in Bali. But I actually was in China in August of 2016 when Uber pulled out. I was in Shanghai, and I had been using Uber all week to get around. And then all of a sudden, they decided, while I was there, that they no longer were going to operate in China. They were going to fold that business to their competitor, Didi, in the area. And overnight, Uber no longer worked. That was good for the market, since it wasn't succeeding there. It was really bad for me as a consumer, because Didi requires that you have a Chinese credit card and you can speak Mandarin. So bad news for me. But they didn't have product market fit there, and so they pulled out because it wasn't a successful business for them. So the next idea that I think sets growth apart is the idea of team organization and how growth teams in particular are organized. Now, growth teams tend to have functions that cross many different areas. They have product, they have analytics, experimentation, design, engineering, content. All of these different functionalities come together on one team, on one growth team, or one huddle, or a product team, or whatever it might be called in various businesses, all working towards the same goal. And I think that's a big mindset shift from your more traditional marketing, digital marketing organizations, where you have a team full of marketers and not necessarily very cross-functional. And I think that's actually one of the core reasons why growth is set apart and why people maybe think about it differently than digital marketing, is because it's often organized differently. But when you think about it, a lot of the actual functions that they do and what they're producing and working towards is the same. Okay. Now that we've level set around what is growth, let's talk about a few growth strategies. Now, I showed you that funnel earlier that we talked about in our San Francisco meetup. Here's another one. This is a typical growth framework. You see 5 different stages, going from awareness to acquisition to onboarding and activation, engagement and retention, reactivation, or in the other one, it was called referral. So this is a typical framework that we look at. And when we're talking about typical growth teams, they often start in startups. It's actually kind of where growth came from, right? And you might have one person in a startup that is focused on growth and focused on all of the different areas. And in a startup, as many of you know, you have to wear a lot of hats. You have to do a lot of different functions. I think that's where a lot of that kind of team organization of growth came from. And then as that company starts to grow, as they maybe start to expand across multiple businesses, multiple functions, that growth team starts to grow. And you might have 2 or 3 or 5 people that may specialize in a function rather than having one jack of all trades. So as I said, this is a typical growth framework. But I actually like to reframe this. And I like to think about this as what I'm calling the AAA growth framework. And this is really focused around the strategic drivers. So it's acquisition, activation, and adoption. And each of these strategic drivers is working towards a desired outcome. Every outcome is going to be measured by specific tactics for that outcome and key measures to look at there. But ultimately, every one of those drivers is working towards the same strategic goal. In the case of Google Analytics, our goal is monthly active users. And so this is kind of framed in that perspective there. We're also internally at Google, we're working with what we call a centralized product growth team. So we have functions all over the company, all over individual teams working together. We have our email and SEO and ads people working very, very closely with our growth marketers, working very closely with our content and education teams, who work very closely with our growth-focused PMs and engineers and data scientists, all, again, working towards that same goal of increasing monthly active users when it comes to the Google Analytics business. So pretty cool. OK, I want to shift gears just a little bit and spend the rest of this topic, or this time, talking about measurement for growth, because this is the meat of what I have for you today. So you can't talk about measurement for growth, or any type of measurement when it comes to growth, without talking about what's called a North Star metric. I'm sure this isn't news to most of you. This is the idea that we're all working towards that same goal, that single metric. This is a quote from Sean Ellis. He's largely credited as being one of the founders of growth marketing. So the North Star metric is the single metric that best captures the core value that your product delivers to your customers. Optimizing your efforts to grow this metric is key to driving sustainable growth across your full customer base. Now, let's look at a few examples of this. What does that actually mean in businesses that we know? So Facebook, they're very focused on daily active users as their North Star metric. Airbnb is looking at nights booked, and Uber is looking at weekly rides. And it's also important to remember that a North Star metric should not only have value for the company, it should have value for the user, because if it doesn't, that's not a metric that is really sustainable when it comes to growth of your business, right? So if I'm a user of Airbnb and I'm booking a night, they're getting value, I'm getting value, and if I like it enough, I'm going to continue to book more nights. So that's actually a really good thing to continue to look at. When it comes to the Google Analytics business, like I said, we're mostly focused on monthly active users. So Google Analytics is monthly active users. Google Optimize, which is our experimentation platform, is monthly active experiments. And Data Studio is also monthly active users. Sorry, missed a slide there. So the thing I wanted to round out here is key metrics by life stage. And we're going to look at all of these. So I'm going to come back to this slide throughout the next part of the presentation. But we're going to look at all of the different metrics that you want to focus on across the AAA growth framework, so across acquisition, activation, and adoption. We're going to start with acquisition. So when it comes to acquisition, it's all about capturing eyes, capturing impressions, and turning them into conversions, turning them into new users, and really focusing on what the average cost of that is and how you can optimize that. So let's look at some examples. Now, when it comes to impressions, we are creating content all over the web, whether that be email or ads or social media, whatever that might be. Putting a lot of different information out there. We want to be sure that we're tracking all of this, of course, so that we understand if somebody is just viewing one of our pieces of content or if they're actually clicking on it and engaging with us. And when it comes to all of this work that we've put into this really good content that we're making, we want to capture that acquisition. So we don't just want to capture the click, we want to follow that through to an acquisition for our products. So a few of the things that you might want to look at here and pay attention to. Campaign tracking. So I think a lot of you guys said you use Google Analytics, right? Yeah? Wonderful. I love Google Analytics. Have you been using campaign tracking or UTM tracking? Raise your hands. Wonderful. OK. UTM tracking or campaign tracking, for those who don't know, are just little pieces of information that you're going to put on the end of a URL, on the end of a link, to make sure that you can understand where somebody came from, if they came from an email or an ad or from a social media post or whatever it might be. Now, I just want to spend a little bit more time here because this is really important. You want to actually track this down to the individual post level. So I have an example here. This is from my personal blog. Every time that I blog about something, and every time I post it, whether that be on Twitter, on Google+, soon not to be on Google+, on Slack, or wherever that might be, I'm adding individual UTM parameters to every single post. Now, what that does is after I collected a bunch of data, after doing this for a while, I was able to start analyzing the type of posts and the type of channel that's driving my traffic. So you can see here that I'm actually using the content field, which is kind of like a bonus field in UTM tracking, to denote the title of the post that I'm sending people to. And in the source and medium, I have the channel, which was social, and the actual source, which was either Twitter or Google+ in this case. So when I started doing a lot of digging into this data, what I noticed was that when I post something about Google Tag Manager, more so than anywhere else and any other type of content, I'm actually getting a lot of traffic from Google+. Now again, who knew people still use Google+? People aren't going to be using Google+ much longer. Yeah. But there was actually a really active Google Tag Manager community on Google+. So when I posted content there, it was shared quite a bit, and people actually clicked through and came to my blog to read that content. But when I posted about pretty much anything else, the majority of my traffic came from Twitter. Now, that's not an analysis I would have been able to do had I not gone to the level of detail of adding in the type of post and the name of that post to every single individual campaign parameters that I added to my URLs. And you can get much more granular with this. You can add date stamps. You can add time of day to this. And you can start doing day parting by content type, by channel. Very cool analysis to do to really see what is driving the needle in terms of actually capturing those impressions and getting them onto your site to turn them into an acquisition. Now, a few other things here: page tracking, event tracking, all of these things very important. But I think the underlying point here is that you need to have the right data structures in place. You need to be collecting the right data to be able to analyze that down the road and optimize all of your efforts. And I want to give you an example of that. So I mentioned Google Tag Manager. Who's familiar with Google Tag Manager? OK, a good number of you. It's a tag management system product. We make it. It helps you to implement Google Analytics and a bunch of other tags on your websites. And this is a piece of Google Tag Manager called the data layer. It's a bunch of extra code that you can put on your page to be able to collect more information about what's going on. So this is kind of a standard data layer. I want to look at an example for a company called Postmates, which is a food delivery company in the US, kind of like a Deliveroo here. Now I'm home in San Francisco, and I'm getting hungry. And so I go ahead and I Google Italian food Postmates SF. And that first one, that looks pretty good, Tommaso's restaurant in San Francisco. So I click, and I get taken to their Postmates page for this restaurant. That lasagna looks really good. I think I'm going to order it. But now I'm kind of flipping my perspective. And all of a sudden, I'm the analyst for this business. And my boss, she asks me what the top 5 types of food in our top 5 cities are, because we want to create new campaigns around that to really push those types of food and those types of restaurants in those cities. Now, it seems like a pretty simple question to ask an analyst. Seems like something I should have the data to be able to answer, right? Like, of course I want to know my top cities, my top types of food, and create campaigns for that. But if I look at this page in particular, if I focus on this URL, it's kind of hard to see. I'm going to read it for you. It says order.postmates.com/Tommaso's Restaurant San Francisco. There's no page subcategories or subdirectories in that URL that's telling me that San Francisco is a subdirectory that I can search on, or doesn't even mention Italian food in there. So how am I supposed to go into my page analytics, my pages report, and really dig into this detail? I can't. And actually, when you look at a few more pages, they don't all say the city name in there, so I'm kind of out of luck here. And that is where the data layer comes in. So I'm actually going to add a couple of pieces of information to this data layer. I'm going to add city is San Francisco, and page subcategory is Italian. Now I'm going to capture those pieces of information in the data layer via a custom dimension by sending them via Google Tag Manager to Google Analytics. So now I have that information in Google Analytics that I can add to my analysis and start to break down all of my pages and all of my visitors by the city and the type of food that they were searching for, so I can answer my boss's question. So as you can see, having the right data in place or making sure that you're doing what you need to capture the right data is very important to your marketing efforts. Now, one other thing I mentioned here was event tracking. I think event tracking on websites, especially with Google Analytics, is also very important to really driving understanding of what's going on. And I especially like it for form field interaction. So I like to use on-change events to be able to see when somebody has filled in a field and gone on to the next field and so on. I'm going to walk you through an example. But taking a step back, event tracking in Google Analytics, I think some of you are probably familiar, maybe some less familiar. There's 3 parts to event tracking. There's a category, which generally we use for the area of the site that somebody might be clicking on something. The action, which is generally what somebody is doing. They're watching a video, they're downloading a white paper, or starting a trial. And the label, which is more specifics about that action. So the video name, the white paper name, et cetera. OK. So I implemented the Google Analytics marketing website with event tracking. So here we are. And I want to walk you through an example of this on-change event form field interaction. So we're going to go ahead and click on one of these. This is the category, as you can see, the area where somebody might be clicking. So if we click on contact form and dig in, we'll get to the next level of that hierarchy, the action. In this case, we're using the action to actually capture what people indicated they were interested in on the form, so what product. Number 4 is just that they indicated they were interested in all of the products. So if we click on one of these, maybe the first one, Analytics 360 Suite, we get taken to the label. And in this case, the label is the name of the field that somebody interacted with. And a table in Google Analytics is typically sorted by the first column after the primary dimension. So in this case, it would have been sorted by total events. I resorted this table by unique events. You can see by the downward arrow in the top right-hand corner. And that actually does something pretty neat. It puts this in a funnel order. This is actually the order of my form. People are going in order from first name to last name to job level, et cetera. And there's not a huge drop-off between any one of those steps, which is actually very promising. That's pretty good, right? Most forms don't have that success. There's an outlier here. It's region. That's because that one is an optional form field. But there's one other thing on here, or two other things, that are pretty interesting, that are standing out to me as an analyst. So who can tell me what that might be? Don't be shy, shout it out. Services, yep. So services and submit. And specifically, I was really interested in that submit line. So line number 9, what you can see is that the total events for submit is significantly higher than the unique events, whereas for most of the rest of the fields, they're pretty close. What this tells me is that people were trying to submit this form over and over and over again, but were not successful in actually submitting it. So I put my UX research hat on, and I went to the website, and I decided to fill out this form myself to see why this might be. And what I found was that actually, you know those little asterisks that are usually on fields to let you know that they are required? They were really small. So I think people were filling out the form not realizing that a field was required because they didn't see the asterisk, tried to submit, got an error, had to do it again, got an error, bad user experience. So I took this feedback back to my product and eng teams. They fixed it very quickly, and we were able to get those numbers much more in line again. And this is an insight I wouldn't have had if I didn't do form field interaction with event tracking. So very, very useful to understand that user journey, and in this case, that user pain point that I could help solve for pretty easily. So the next part of the AAA growth framework is activation. And in this case, we are looking at how we can turn those impressions and those clicks into activated users. And we're measuring the success rate of that and the cost of that success. And if we're not able to activate them, they've gone inactive, we're going to send them back through that impression and acquisition phase. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. So with Google Ads, time to first interaction is a pretty big one for this activation phase. So a couple of examples here, maybe Uber, time to first ride, Deliveroo, time to first order, any e-commerce site, time to first purchase. For ads, it's signing up is, that's the acquisition phase, but until you actually create and run your first campaign, you're not an activated customer, right? When we think about that for Google Analytics, we have people signing up for our product as well. But until you actually put that code on your page and start collecting data and using the features, you're not activated in our product. And so the question is, how can we make this time period shorter? How can we get you activated faster and reduce that time to first interaction? So a few examples here. One of the things that we could look at is experimenting with making implementation easier. Now, I need to caveat this and say, these are not things that we are actually doing. Don't tell the world that I said this is something we're doing. These are just ideas. But maybe on this code page where, after you've signed up for your account, you have to implement this code, you have this thing that you have to copy and paste and put into your template or email to your developer. What if we could just take all of that process away and have a big red button that said, add Google Analytics code, and when you push that, we could just inject that code into your site for you, and you didn't have to mess around with changing it. That would be pretty cool, right? That would certainly reduce the time to interaction and get you using the product faster. So another thought experiment is reducing the product disconnect to help increase that stickiness and that activation. Now, I mentioned custom dimensions earlier. It's a feature in Google Analytics. But to actually use a custom dimension, there's 2 steps. You have to create the custom dimension in the admin panel in Google Analytics, and then you have to implement the code for that, either through Google Tag Manager or hard-coded on your page. So what if, as you're creating this custom dimension in the interface of Google Analytics, there was a button right next to it that said, push to Google Tag Manager, and we just pushed that configuration right there, and all you had to do was publish the container to make that go live, rather than having to set it up yourself. That would be great. I see some heads nodding. I think that would be great. It would definitely reduce the time between doing these things, reduce the time to interaction and getting activated on this feature, and increase stickiness of the product. So one last thing that we are doing here is something that we call guided flows. Now, these are cool little blue boxes that will pop up based on different in-product cues. Anybody seen these in Google Analytics? Yeah, a few hands. So a good example is if you've never created a segment in Google Analytics, we might pop one of these up and actually walk you through the entire segment creation process. It's going to say, oh, click here to create a segment. This is what you have to do, and actually handheld you through that process. It's a great way to pair kind of content and education with activation experiments. So I really like this one. So all of this is what I call an activation program, all of these different pieces. And it's really this idea of developing and creating this strategy, working with your different teams to implement it, getting data, understanding how that goes, launching and iterating all around this additional educational content, in this case, to really reduce the time to first interaction. And what we're trying to do here is measure all of that by our number of activations, how much time that takes, how much we can reduce that time, and of course, the value to the business of doing that. So the last area of the AAA growth framework is adoption. And here we are really looking at that adoption rate and how we can get people moving throughout this whole framework. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is email nurture campaigns. Now, this is something that we do with Google Analytics. On day 0, when you sign up for a new account of Google Analytics, you're going to get a welcome email. It's going to say, welcome to Google Analytics. Here's a bunch of resources to help you get started, a nice big blue button to take you to product to get started. You get the picture. But then what we're doing, every 30 days after that, we're sending what we call a monthly performance report, which is looking at your account and actually crunching some numbers for you to tell you what's going right or what is going wrong and what you might want to pay attention to. I see some heads nodding. You may have seen these. They're a great way to actually nurture customers, and if we haven't seen you in a while, potentially get you to log into product and come back and continue to use our product. So we're looking at things like open rates and click-through rates, monthly re-engagement, and that retention rate with this practice. So next we have full funnel analysis. And this is really the idea of measuring the user journey across the board. One of the newer initiatives that we've launched with Google Analytics is a partnership with Salesforce. And in this case, I'm looking at the integration with Sales Cloud. And that integration allows you to send offline lead status change events to Google Analytics as an event. And in this case, I've thrown that data into a custom funnel in Google Analytics, and I'm looking at people who came to my site, submitted a lead on the site. That lead has now gone off-site, and they've interacted with somebody on the phone or via whatever sales channel you have. And at some point, maybe somebody dropped out of that funnel offline. I can actually, in this report, create a segment or an audience of people that have fallen off offline and remarket to them online, which is really, really cool. So we also have retention and lifetime value, which are important metrics. And I have a picture up here of Amazon. I think this is such a brilliant move on their part. Have you guys seen the subscribe and save box on Amazon when you go to purchase something there? Usually comes up for things like toothpaste or deodorant or toilet paper, things that you really should be using pretty often. And it gives you this price that you see in the search results as the lower price, which is the subscribe and save price. When you actually click through the search result, you see that you have to subscribe to get that price, or you can pay more to get the one-time price. But who wants to pay more? So it's a really great tactic to actually get somebody to subscribe to save money. So the last thing I have for you here is targeting for re-engagement. And this is looking at an example from Google Analytics for Firebase. And in this case, we're using our analytics data of things like lifetime value greater than 0, or purchasers, or high-scoring users, to create an audience of those users, and then incentivize them to come back, maybe sending them a push notification for an offer for a free character in our game or our app. And this is a great way to drive re-engagement through push notifications and getting people who may have churned, but who you knew to be a very valuable user prior, back into your app. So after all of this, you might be asking yourself, so aren't we all growth marketers? Well, I certainly think I'm a growth marketer after listening to this, but maybe not, right? There are a few things here. I think the biggest difference between a growth-minded organization and a more tactical product and marketing-driven organization is the willingness to take risks, to experiment. But it's also North Star metrics and full funnel analysis and team organization and the idea of an experimentation mindset, and that velocity is greater than accuracy, and that risk can equal reward. So with that, I just wanted to leave you with a quick summary. So we talked about a lot of things today. Growth marketing may or may not equal digital marketing. It really depends on the organization. Growth teams are based on a fast-acting team structure and a culture of rapid experimentation and risk-taking. We have the AAA growth framework, which is acquisition, activation, and adoption. And finally, please don't call it growth hacking. All right, that's it for me. Thank you very much.